Hi guys, good to see you. Dr. Gillard here. This is going to be week 1, our dermatology first lecture. It is spring 2020. Hope you guys are all doing well. So obviously I'm not appearing before you. But nevertheless, I'm here in my little man cave home office recording studio. And I'll be doing these videos as long as I can keep up. I'm going to try to do these as long as possible and put them on YouTube. I will leave a link down below for a new YouTube page that I've created that is dedicated just to the spring of 2020, all my classes. So, for those of you who have been asking me for embryology notes and spinal anatomy notes, all the videos are going to be up. So you can retake the class if you wish. Send me an email if you want the actual slides. And maybe I'll put those up somewhere where everybody can download them. All right, but here we go. This is dermatology, and off we go. Today we'll talk about the basics just to kind of bring our brains back up to date with regard to what the skin is. And we'll talk about 2 diseases, Bullous, Pemphigoid, and a little bit of psoriasis as well. Right, here are some books, and you guys know me by now. You don't really need any books. These slides are wordy. These are my teaching slides, so they're well referenced. So you don't really need any. This is a great one right here, Bologna. Is it about $400? It used to be. It's a really expensive one. If I had to buy one, it's kind of a toss between Habif. I guess I would go with Fitzpatrick. Very good storyteller. It mirrors. There is a chiropractic dermatology for chiropractic book. It just is not up to speed, not even close to the quality of these. These are the big medical books here. So if you have extra money, I would buy Fitzpatrick and Habif. If you have lots of money, I would buy this set from Rook. I don't even have this. You used to be able to see it on Google Books before Google Books kind of collapsed. But yeah, this is $600, but this is super evidence-based, and some of these slides have been referenced by this set. But anyway, that's the deal. Histology, we'll do a little histology here and there. June Kira is the Board of Chiropractic Examiner's book. The questions for histology will come only from this book. This is the Medical Ross, which is... if you put the 2 together, you can get a pretty darn good story. All right, here we go. The skin, okay, that's your stuff covering your body, right? Also known as the integument, the cutaneous membrane. Bloody. It's the largest single organ in the body. That's a nice fun fact. It's composed, of course, of the epidermis and the dermis. A great embryology question. Epidermis is derived from ectoderm. Dermis is derived from mesoderm, or you go deeper, division of the mesoderm is the sclerotome. So that's a little weird. Anytime there's weirdness like that, good chance a board question will pop up. The dermis we'll look at the layers of the epidermis. The dermis has 2 divisions, papillary layer and a reticular layer. Now, we're talking about skin, right? What about the hypodermis? You got to be careful with this because some authors include the hypodermis as the skin, but June Kira, the board book, does not. So the hypodermis, aka subcutaneous tissue, subcutaneous membrane, subcutis layer, superficial fascia, which is a gross anatomy term, that's all the 3rd layer down. But it is not the skin, according to June Kira, the histology book. Right? It's loose connective, of course. A lot of fat can fill in to that layer. That's the one that supports the fat. Very loosely bound to the dermis. It pulls right apart if you've ever, I don't know if it's politically correct to even say this nowadays, but back in the day, we used to trap in the winter for extra money. I don't think you're even allowed to do that nowadays. But when you pull the fur off an animal, the epidermis and the dermis do not come apart. Those hemidesmosomes are bound very tightly, but the loose fat pulls right apart because the hypodermis has no hemidesmosomes, or it has nothing to hang on to. So it's very easily to pull that off. It does contain lots of fat cells, adipocytes. And yep, there's my little rant there. Some authors say it's the skin, some don't. We will not say it's a member of the skin. Here's a look at where you've learned before with Dr. Doe. Epidermis is this top layer. Then we have the dermis, papillary layer. These are the ones, the papillary layer is the one that the hemidesmosomes dig into. It's kind of an intermediate, but we won't go that deep. The reticular layer here, hypodermis is down here. Remember, there are normally no nerves or blood vessels in the epidermis. Those are down in the papillary layer of the dermis. Okay, general classes of skin. There's two classes of skin, hirsute skin and glabrous skin. So the thickness of the skin makes the determination. Glabrous skin has an extra layer, and we'll look at that in a second. Actually, the second is here. So hirsute skin means hair, so that's pretty hairy. This is all hirsute skin. Skin on your forearm, the chest, everywhere except the palms and the soles of your feet, right? That's the glabrous skin. So the thick skin is glabrous skin, contains no hair, palms and soles. It has two layers depending on which author you read. Stratum lucidium sometimes shows up, and a stratum granulosum is this. Well, we'll look at this when we get to it. Oh, it has sweat glands still. Yeah, we don't need to say that. All right, let's look into the epidermis. It's the outermost layer of skin, completely avascular, right? Has no blood vessels, so it has to receive its nutrients and oxygen via diffusion from the dermal blood vessels underneath. Right, if we go back to here, there's where it gets fed right there. See, there's capillaries, and there's an interstitium, and the fluid and the oxygen goes out. Carbon dioxide from the basal layer, it's fed from right there. All right. We, of course, remember from Dr. Doe days, this is keratinized stratified squamous epithelium made of 4 to 6 layers of progressively flattened cells. They start out quite square-like, but they get flatter and flatter and flatter as they rise to the top. The epidermis is anchored into the papillary, the dermis, via epidermal papillae and epidermal pegs. Sometimes there's called epidermal ridges or reet pegs, depending on who you read. And it's basically a peg and socket series where the peg sits in the socket. But the key, and sometimes that's called interdermal digitations. I'll show you a picture in a second. But it would be nothing without these magical hemidesmosomes. What's the difference between hemidesmosomes and desmosomes? I always say H. Oh, that's a bad color, isn't it? That's a bad color for this, too. It's a pretty cool little program, actually. H, I always say, hides in the basement. Hemidesmosomes hide in the basement. That means they're on the bottom. Desmosomes are around the top and are around the sides of the keratinocytes. Okay, so hemidesmosomes hide in the basement. Can't see them here, but here are the pegs, the epidermal pegs, and they fit into these slots between the epidermal papillae. Hemidesmosomes are not shown, but we'll look at them right now. So I used to make you learn all this stuff, and I don't anymore. Maybe you have studied this with Dr. Doe, but this is a basal in the stratum basale. This is a basal cell, stem cell-ish type thing. And it has, here's the cytoskeleton coming in, right? The cell has a cytoskeleton, and it's connected to this rivet head, this plaque. How is it connected? By something called BP230. BP230. And there's urban and plectin as well, which we're not as worried about. It's BP230 that I do want you to know that one. Okay, then there's other laminin 5, and there's some other ones here. Why do I care about BP230? There's actually an autoimmune disease that attacks nothing else in the body except BP230. And if you got that disease, it's a really bad one. It causes a horrible inflammation, and it rips the cytoskeleton loose from the hemidesmosome. And therefore, your skin, your epidermis and dermis, can swell apart because of the inflammation, and you get these gigantic, these bullae, they're called. They're like blisters. Get these giant bullae all over your skin. It's a horrible disease. And yeah, here's a poor little guy who has it. The disease is called Bullous Pemphigoid. And we're just going to present this one. This is the most common autoimmune-related disease of the skin. There's probably 6, 7 other blistering diseases. This one is bad, but it's not as deadly as another one called Pemphigus vulgaris. Is more deadly than this, but it's much more rare, so I'm not going to get into it. I'm just going to do the most common one here. We don't have a lot of time in this class. I'm actually considering trying to petition to get this to be its own class because I've heard so many students say, oh my God, dermatology was hit heavily on boards. So we'll see how that goes. But here, the BP230, we have a cartoon demonstrating my amazing Photoshop skills. Notice the different colors here. But this is an inflammation. And yeah, it rips the cytoskeleton right out, and you bubble up because of that. Right? Some more pictures of it. Older people. Fun facts. Bullous pemphigoid might show up on the boards as pemphigoid. So watch out for that. Don't confuse. Just remember that's an AKA pemphigoid. Don't confuse it with the pole vaulter. I took these slides out because it's rarer than Marfan syndrome. But PV, I always think pole vaulter, you know those guys, and they run down the runway and they stick that pole into the ground and go up into the air. Sometimes the pole breaks and they come down and they get kind of road rash all over them. So that's how I remember pole vaulters really, really get hurt with this disease. So that's Pemphigus vulgaris. That's all I'll say about that. That's by far the most deadly one of these blistering diseases. But the BP, the bullous pemphigoid, yeah, it's not as devastating as Pemphigus vulgaris. The mortality rate has been on the rise, and they can't quite figure that out. It usually shows up in older people. Really old people get it, but children can also be affected. How does it present early on? Starts out as unexplained hives, and the patient will get these hives, and they go to an allergist, and they get tested for everything under the sun, and they can't find it. Hives can be the early sign of cancer too. Had a friend of my wife's first sign of her breast cancer was the development of hives, and it took almost a year before they figured out it was breast cancer, and the body was reacting to the spread. It was stage 4. So but that's the most initial presentation of that. And this is called a urticaria. We'll talk about language of dermatology in the next lecture, but urticaria is like these little wheels that pop up, and we'll talk about those when the time comes. And yeah, it's usually about a 12-month delay to make the diagnosis here. Most common site of affection is the abdomen, the groin, flexor surfaces of the arms. And that's all I'll say. I took the rest of the slides. I don't want to go too deep on that. But there is a Hansen sign that you need to know about. Hansen sign is usually negative in these patients. What in the heck is Hansen sign? Well, if you get a blister, let's say here's your skin, the back surface of your hand, and you get a blister. And then let's see, we'll make a pink hand. If you push down on the blister, so you take your finger and you push down on the blister will not increase in size. People with a positive Hansen sign, the blister will now become this big. So you've ripped the affected cams, including hemidesmosomes, Because Pemphigus vulgaris, the pole vaulter, it does have a positive Hansen sign. So just by pushing down, you will spread, make the bulla even bigger. So that's a Hansen sign. But in Bullous pemphigoid, it is not positive. So you'll probably pop the little blister before anything happens. It also has a negative Nikolsky sign. What is Nikolsky sign? Let's see if I can draw that. So here's the back of the hand. And this, of course, is why I don't draw, right? Back of the hand. So we have a blister here. So if you take your thumb and you rub it on the skin right here, do a friction on the skin, nothing will happen. If this patient has Pemphigus vulgaris or has Pemphigus vulgaris, this thing will morph. The bulla will actually morph into the area that you rubbed because the hemidermosomes are destroyed. Okay, so that's a Nikolsky sign. Bottom line is, let me turn that there. So bottom line is people with bullous pemphigoid have a negative Hansen's and Nikolsky sign, but people with a positive pole vaulter, Pemphigus vulgaris, they have a positive Hansen's and Nikolsky sign, and it's just a more inflammatory type damage to the skin is seen. How about some fun facts? Diagnosis is made. You can order immunofluorescent testing. In children, the disease, when it pops up, it tends to go into remission for a while. The lesions may heal up, but it tends to come back. Treatment, as with most dermatological conditions, is with topical corticosteroids. You can add daprsone, which is a powerful antibiotic that you can rub on it as well. Okay, we're out of that little rabbit hole. And let's go back to our little review of histology. Let's look at the layers of the epidermis. So we have first the stratum corneum. That's the skin. Everybody rub the back of your hands. That's the stratum corneum right there. What are the names of the cells of the stratum corneum? Corneocytes, or sometimes they're called squames. I've even heard horny cells in some books, but not the major ones. Corneocyte is the most common name for the cell. And these cells are dead, right? They're just bags of keratin and filaggrin, which has lassoed the keratin into just these flat strands. Super duper hard, protective. It's got a lot of wax and hydrophobic stuff around the outside we'll look at, but it's dead. There's no mitochondria, there's no nucleus, there's no ribosomes, no nucleoles, there's nothing. It's dead. And after a little while, when you just rub the back of your hand, you just flaked some of those, whether you can see it or not, you just flake some of those skin cells off. Now, the next layer down is there sometimes, and it's not. So this is the stratum lucidium. This is only seen in thick skin. So on your palm or on your foot has an extra layer. And it's really almost an AKA for the stratum corneum. It's just that these cells are not quite as dead. They're pretty dead, but they haven't clumped. The protein or the collagen filaments haven't clumped together enough. Therefore, it's quite see-through. So stratum lucidium, only seen in glabrous skin, and it's right underneath the stratum corneum. Some, like June Kira, considers it a subdivision of stratum corneum, and Ross does as well. Okay, next layer down is the stratum granulosum. So what's the name of these cells? Easy, granular cells live in the stratum granulosum. Next layers down, it's usually 3 to 5. These are differentiating cells. They're dying, but they're not as dead as the ones above. But the organelles are pretty much gone in these, especially toward the top layer. But filaggrin is coming into effect here. So filaggrin, usually in the form of something called keratinohyaline granules, becomes very prevalent in this layer. and the flagrin binds with the collagen, or with the keratin filaments. Keratin is what makes the skin so strong, and it kind of binds to and makes them really, really tough and flattens out these keratin molecules. And then another important concept is these lamellar granules, which they're little granules that are within the granulocytes, and they can move to the cell membrane and undergo exocytosis and spit out their contents. What is the contents of these lamellar granules? Lipid, little fat balls. And therefore they dump a ton of lipid. Lipid's hydrophobic, right? So that's like a waterproofing around the cell. So bugs that are crawling on you right now, they can't get through this stuff. Water can't seep into your skin, and chemicals don't seep into your skin very good. Although there's some exceptions to that when we talk about the atopic dermatitis, some of those things. If you lose your barrier function, you're susceptible to atopic dermatitis and things like that. We'll get to that. Okay, next layer down, this is the prickly layer. This is the stratum spinosum. The cells are called prickle cells or spiny cells. This is usually the thickest layer of the epidermis. Some confusion going on here about the stratum germinativum. I think I might have had a slide wrong at the beginning. It's the stratum germinativum. I won't flip back, but this is the weird layer. So your board book says about this layer, first we should say stratum basale, that has stem cells called basal cells in them. In some people, in some specimens, you can see stem cells that aren't connected to the bottom. They're actually lifted off and floating a little bit higher. If you see basal cells that are above this stratum basale, then Junqueira says, he calls it that layer the stratum germinativum. So as the layer, if this layer and the stratum basale are filled with these little things, then both layers are, or the layer is called the stratum germinativum. Ross, the medical book, says that the stratum germinativum is just an AKA for stratum basale, and you only say it's stratum germinativum when you see these basal cells that are lifted off the bottom and floating around, just in case that ever comes up. And then the very bottom layer, the stratum basale, again, Ross says the AKA is stratum germinativum. It's the deepest layer, right? The cells are called basal cells. They sit on a basement membrane. They have hemidesmosomes growing out of the bottoms of them that connect to the dermis. They're usually cuboidal or columnar in shape. These guys are stem cells. They can divide into a new, because when the cell divides, it kills itself, but it replaces itself. But it also creates a keratinocyte above it. And those are going to be the spiny cells next, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it can also make all the other stuff, these cells. It makes the hemidesmosomes that are needed, makes desmosomes, and you name it, it can make it. But it's normally a single layer, gives rise to all the keratinocytes, all the hemidesmosomes and desmosomes. Right, here's a nice drawing of the skin. So this is the way we just went. There's the stratum corneum, stratum lucidium. So if you ever saw this, we know is this glabrous skin or hirsute skin? Must be glabrous because there's a stratum lucidium here. Stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum can be really thick. We won't get into all these other skin cells. There's a Langerhans cell there. Merkel's tactile organ is right here. There's the cell. Won't get into all that stuff. But yeah, and there's a stratum basale, right? A single layer of these stem cell magical baselines. Where did all these cells come from? Who are they? Are there stem cells in these regions as well? No, these guys are dividing, right? Let me turn on my little drawer. So this guy divides, this guy right here divides through meiosis or mitosis. Meiosis is only the gametes. For mitosis, it splits in half. One is, it creates itself, and then it creates a new little guy right here. I don't know why it doesn't have a nucleus, but it should have a nucleus. Great. And then it happens again. The new one divides again. What happens to this guy? he gets pushed up. You see, as these get pushed up further and further away from the blood supply, they start to die and differentiate. But all these layers, they all come from the same place. These are the keratinocytes. And I guess I could draw it pretty flat up here. But that's how that works, right? It's like a conveyor belt process. Should be a review for everybody, right? Meet the cells. Epidermal tissue is made up of epidermal cells. The most common of all these, that scenario I just told you, they're called keratinocytes. Keratinocytes. Who are the keratinocytes? Well, we just told you who they were. The corneocytes, the granulocytes, the prickle cells or the spiny cells. Those are all keratinocytes at various stages of life. There's 3 other cells. We got to talk about melanocytes. These are really important to us because melanoma is a cancer, is a mutation of melanocytes, super deadly. What's the name of the cell that gives rise to the melanocyte? Right? Because they're born. Melanocytes come from have a kind of a proform, a early form. Those are called melanoblasts. And if mitosis starts happening in a melanoblast like crazy, what does that create? That goes all the way up to the skin. And they keep dividing throughout most of your life in this one region. There's the surface of your skin. Well, they're melanocytes. They're filled with melanin. So that is your nevus. That's a mole or a birthmark. Talk about that when the time comes. But those are really important. Langerhans cells are immune cells, Merkel cells, light touch, things like that. We're not going to talk too much about them. We are going to talk about our little friend, the melanocyte, who looks like an octopus. There's the cute little thing here. So this is the stratum basale down here. Melanocyte has tentacles, and it literally stabs its tentacles into all these newly created keratinocytes, and it injects melanin in there. The melanin then forms a nuclear cap or a shield around the nucleus. Why do we want to shield the nucleus? Who's in the nucleus? That's very delicate, especially to radiation, UV radiation from the sun. Chromosomes, right? Those things are very delicate. You mess one of those up and you could turn the gene into a monster here, an immortal monster that replicates too fast, and that's cancer. So cool. So the melanocyte squirts melanin. The darker your skin color is, the more your skin, the more these cells were injected with melanin, right? Some people who are really light, your melanocytes, there's not maybe as many, and they don't inject as much. People who are really dark have more melanocytes, and they are very busy. They make your skin darker. What's the great irony of our little friend here, the melanocyte? Where's its nuclear cap? It doesn't have one. So why in the world the committee designed the melanocyte to be so non-selfish? It doesn't even inject itself, but that's the problem. This guy can be affected by the sun, UV radiation, and it has no shield over it. And so it can mutate into a cancer, and a nasty cancer. Melanoma is very, very deadly. Killed Bob Marley. Kills many people each year. I've known students who have had this. So we'll take a look at that one. Actually, I think I'm going to show you it right now to already start to burn it into your brain. So this guy is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If we laid it out this way, it's probably 8 millimeters. Anything bigger than the eraser tip of your pencil, your number 2 pencil, is 6 millimeters. Should never be bigger than that. That's one of the ABCs. Your job is just to refer out and let the dermatologist worry about it. But when it's variegated like this, it's dark here, it's super light here, it's pink here. You can't fold this in half very well. It's not round like a nevus or like a mole is. Moles can have this coloring, this variegation. But this is malignant melanoma. So this is nothing to mess around with. It's got to be removed and biopsied and see how deep it's went. We'll definitely come back to that one. What about this one? Looks like melanoma, doesn't it? This is the great melanoma imitator. This is called seborrheic seborrheic keratosis. We'll talk about this too. But it breaks the ABCs. It's like 8 millimeters. It's dark here. It's light here. It's variegated. Super light out here. You send this one out every time. But now, I hesitate to teach you this, but if you look under a magnifying glass, you see these little pearl bead appearance, the little beads here. You virtually never see that in melanoma. So you can tell that seborrheic keratosis by those little bubbles there. That's not for you to call though, so don't, because even lesions like this can occasionally, they can become melanoma anyway. Even the dermatologist would most likely take a biopsy just to be safe, even though he knew it's probably SK. Okay, keratinocytes make up 95% of all the cells. They are created by the stratum basale, as we already said. They live in the deepest part, the stratum basale. We already said all this. They're born via mitosis, everything I already said. They split in two. One remains just like that picture. One pushes up to the new keratinocyte, and they go up and up and up like that little picture. It's nice being able to do the PowerPoint here because I got this very cool little drawing tool, which I don't have when I do the lectures in school. But anyway, so we talked about that. As the cells move up, they die. They get farther away from their blood, and they die. And the process of them turning into different, like spiny cells and granular cells and cornicytes, that's death. But that's called cell differentiation. So they go through a process of cell differentiation. And here's another picture that's pretty good. There's our stem cells, and they create new keratinocytes, and they're getting farther and farther away from the blood, right? Where's the blood? Remember, the blood is down here. Here's the dermis. So we got some blood vessels down here feeding these guys, and they get a little bit of blood. But once you get up here, there's not much blood going on, so they do die. But yeah, so look, see how they're starting to flatten out as they get higher glabrous skin, stratum lucidium. By the time we're up there, they're just super hard keratin with a waxy layer built around them. Right, everything I said, on their journey up, they become more flat. They fill with more keratin. The keratin machines are spitting out keratin, more filaggrin, which wraps the keratin into thick bundles. Lamellar granules, which spit out that waxy waterproofing stuff. Pretty much we've already said. And then they die. So the average life cycle for a cell from the time it's born to the time it sloughs off your skin and falls onto in your bed or wherever, 23 days. So that's the average. It's up to 30 days in some people. Older people, it's a little slower. But yeah, pretty fast. And that skin doesn't go to waste. And when I went to school, we had no idea about these little dust mite things. But I used to have a whole section on this, but I just don't have enough time. I got to get the diseases you'll see in your office. But these dust mites, a lot of people are allergic to these things. And they can live in your mattress. This is an electron microscopic view of a mattress. And you can see it's infested with mites. And people are allergic, and they can have skin lesions and eczema, runny noses, and the whole 9 yards. If you have a mysterious, the dermatologists know, they test you. Yeah, even Kaiser knows that by now. They test. My wife was in there for hives and tested her for dust mites, and she's like, "What? They're in our mattress?" I said, "Not in our mattress, honey, but they really are." She would freak out and make me buy a new one. It's not that old. The turnover rate, we already said, is 23 days. It's, some diseases can crank this turnover rate way up because of irritation. And one, of course, and we'll talk about this a little bit, psoriasis. I just put this in actually today. I had it in a long time ago. I took it out, but I never have time to get to it. I do have old YouTube lectures of this up there, but we got to talk about this a little bit. So psoriasis, the turnover rate of keratinocytes is 20 times sped up by a factor of 28. So your basal cells are really getting irritated and cranking out these keratinocytes like crazy. It's an autoimmune process. We're pretty sure of that now. There's no cure. Once you have this, you're in the club. It does go into remission, and if you try to stay away from the triggering factors, like stress is one, certain bugs, amongst other things, you can keep it in remission. There's strong anti-tumor necrosis factor alpha medication that these people have to take, and but it's really disabling. Certain percentages are associated with psoriatic, like Phil Nicholson, right? This psoriatic arthritis guy. It affects, let's see, I forget what it is. We'll see in a minute. It's like 30%, I think. But let's do some fun facts about psoriasis. Prevalence is not like Marfan syndrome. It's 2% of the population. Marfan's is 0.01, you'll remember. The peak age is around 22 years old. It's definitely, there's a genetic risk factor. If your mom or dad has psoriasis, you have an 8% chance of getting it. If mom and dad have psoriasis, you got almost a 50% chance, 41% chance of getting it. Some races are affected more than others. I didn't list them all, but the surprising one is North American and South American Indians, almost unheard of to have psoriasis in this group. We don't know why that is. No cure, we already said that. They go through exacerbations. It flares up and it comes down and it flares up. Emotionally, really disabling to people, especially if they have it bad on their face. And it can be physically disabling if they have the psoriatic arthritis as well. These flare-ups that are stimulated by certain environmental factors like bacterial infections or mosquito bite that you scratch. And maybe you know you shouldn't scratch it, but at night you subconsciously scratch it. That's the number one instigator of psoriasis, and it can take months for that to settle down. So you absolutely can't scratch if you have psoriasis. You get bit by something and it's itchy, you better put mittens on when you go to sleep so you don't scratch it at night. Certain drugs, I won't list them all. Ironically, even corticosteroids, some people, it can flare up psoriasis reaction. Their emotional factors, about 40% of people with psoriasis get an outbreak, a flare-up of it if they're really stressed out. So it's super common, much higher than children. If children get stressed out, they tend to break out in psoriatic rashes like this. It frequently does begin in childhood after a sore throat, a streptococcal pharyngitis. They get a sore throat, and then boom, here the skin lesion comes. Pathogenicity, according to Habif, it is considered an out-of-control immune-based inflammatory process, i.e. an autoimmune inflammation, which we don't know for sure who the target is. There's some theories I'm not going to get into, but it is an out-of-control inflammatory process. It attacks the skin. We said in joints, psoriatic arthritis shows up in about 17% of people who have the skin form. It's treated with tumor necrosis factor alpha blocking agents. Methotrexate is one of the etanercept. Those are one of the common ones there that you've heard. There used to be an old commercial, The Heartbreak of Psoriasis. Hasn't been around for, I don't think you guys have seen it, but it was a big commercial for many years. What does that mean, the heartbreak? Most people who have psoriasis, they don't have the psoriatic arthritis, but it's just heartbreaking. When they get an outbreak of it, they can't go to social events. They don't want people to think they have the plague or something. They're scared of being discovered, so they avoid a lot of social activity, and it's just a real bummer. The lesions are, now we haven't done the language of dermatology yet, but by the time midterm comes, this will make more sense to you. It's a scaling. They start out with papules, these little bumps on their skin, and they're red, they're itchy, and they coalesce into a big round or oval-shaped plaque lesion is classic. The plaque usually starts out like this with a little silver. If they've been having the disease for a long time, sometimes they get this silvery white look to them. These are classic psoriatic lesions. This lesion This is a new word for you, so I might as well put it out there today. We'll finish it off next week. It looks like tree bark. And when a lesion looks like that, that's called a lichenified lesion. This lesion is lichenified, or this is an example of lichenification. So put that in your memory banks. That's a sign. This is an eczema. Eczema is a description of the lesion, and eczema is not a disease in and of itself, as we will learn. But this is a lichenified eczematous lesion, plaque actually lesion. We could even go a step further of psoriasis, and that'll make more sense after we get through the language of dermatology. Here's some other lesions. Here's one just starting. It's just starting to have a flare-up of it here. I mean, at this point, it's just the eczema. Can't tell what it is, but once it gets like this and has some little silver linings around it, this is psoriasis. Out of that rabbit hole, I guess we're back to the intermediate filaments. I kind of talked about this. As the keratinocytes move up, they become filled with more and more intermediate filaments, which are made of keratin. Sometimes they're just called, authors are all over the place calling these things, but they're just keratin filaments. And a bunch of keratin filaments get together and they form an intermediate filament. That's just a bigger keratin filament. And then filaggrin comes along and wraps it together and squeezes it flat. So you get these really thick, flat structures. And these are called tonofilaments. Some authors call them cytokeratins. They're the same thing. But it's just keratin. They're just keratin, flat sheets of keratin. So that always gets really confusing. So I left that slide in. Hey, we're done. All right. So hope you enjoyed your first lecture. And as long as I can hold up, I'm going to try to keep these coming out on YouTube. A virtual classroom, I don't like it. I've had problems with it. The students that I've talked to would prefer that I put them up on YouTube. So that's what I'm going to do as long as I don't get buried. Tomorrow I have, I think, 6 hours of lecture. So you guys don't have to worry. Remember, we had that Friday, part of the GIG was on Friday, which strung it out, but now it's all on Thursday, which is good because I get Fridays off, but it's going to be really tough for me. But you don't have to worry because this is all I have you for. So great talking to you again, and we will see you next week.